to maintain its borders across the entire biological sequence. The same is not true if you just take what is called the functionally identical backbone. So the system goes through the exact same dynamical sequence, just based on this shrunken network. But what it lacks is the autonomy, the maintenance of being a causally constrained state, which ultimately should be good for, so the use of being a self-defined a causal entity is that your borders are robust over time, right? So it should withstand perturbations from the environment better than otherwise. So we can distinguish the function of the input-output function of the network from its self-maintenance and its causal constraints on the system itself. And here, just to emphasize again that for IIT, consciousness and intelligence are dissociated. So you can have systems that have a high level of integrated information that aren't intelligent. They don't have an intelligent input-output behavior, but you can also have systems that do have a very intelligent input-output behavior and zero integrated information. So what you see here are in the middle on the diagonal are systems that we do ascribe some level of consciousness to, right? Animals, and what is common to those systems is that they all evolved. So the answer, even though for IIT in principle, consciousness and intelligence are disconnected, an adaptive system, the evolution to the environment with a rich causal structure, does provide a link between the system's behavior and its intrinsic cause-effect structure. And that leads to behaviorally fit systems that do have a high level of integrated information. So the reason isn't that IIT postulates that you have to be intelligent in order to be conscious. It's just that there is advantages to being an integrated system, and those advantages are that integrated systems are more economical in their use of the number of elements and connections available. They allow for a higher degeneracy and function architecture, more robustness, and that also makes them a better substrate for learning new tasks and a substrate for selection. It's hard to program and to understand those systems, but they do form a rich repertoire for all possible sorts of functions that you might need in the future under a change of the environment. And they also provide intrinsic understanding of the environment in the sense that there's context sensitivity because the system can employ more mechanisms and counterfactuals on every situation. So the take of IIT on the evolution of consciousness is that, IIT has those axioms. From there it derives, from the axioms of phenomenology, it derives a formalism to capture the postulates on what the physical system needs to be in order to be a physical substrate of consciousness. From there, we can ask, why did integrated information evolve? What's good about having integrated systems? And that explains why consciousness evolved. And I think I made it in time, so I have time to announce our special issue on integrated information. Please send a paper if you have anything to say about the topic. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a truly fascinating presentation. I'm sure there are many questions. Yeah, Ned? Oh, sorry.
Probably the result on the neuroscience of consciousness that we're most certain about is that consciousness requires neural activation. I don't think anybody would dispute that, at least with regard to the creatures that we know are conscious like us and other animals. But as Scott Aronson has pointed out, IIT allows for a hi-fi network that has no activated nodes. Its hi-fi depends on the counterfactual relations between all the nodes, what would happen if one were activated. So it seems like the most basic fact about consciousness and the brain is one that is incompatible with IIT.
So it is true that IIT does allow for systems to be basically inactive and still have a cause-effect structure. That it distinguishes inactive with inactivated. So while the state can be silent, which in systems of logic gates must be true, right? Because 0 is just the same as 1. There's no difference. If the system isn't able to be activated again, its phi is definitely 0. If there is the possibility, the potential for being activated and for changing its state, even from the intrinsic system itself, then it allows for consciousness. And there is plans on at least testing the most extreme version of inactivity that you could imagine for the human brain, which is sort of potentially substantiated in long-term meditators that have what is called a contentless consciousness, or like empty mind or whatever. And that state is probably going to be a state of very low critical activity, not necessarily 0, of course, but in principle, neural areas that are not firing also contribute to consciousness, just as much as the ones that are firing. But what they do is they specify what is called negative concepts. So something like I don't want to say color because you just pointed out that there is no negative concept of color, but let's say pain, right? I mean, you have pain or you don't have pain in a certain, like in my fingertip or something. And negative concepts will be of lower integrated information. There will be much more. They will be more of a like mix. And positive concepts may stand out more. In that sense, there's definitely a difference in the cause-effect structure of a silent brain than of a intact brain with a differentiated state. But what you said is true in principle.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your animats experiment, where you show a correlation between the phi max and the behavioral fitness.
Yes.
To play the devil's advocate a bit, an alternative explanation, then saying that phi max thereby correlates with fitness, is that actually the recurrent structure of the network takes care of solving the problems by a greater history dependence, codependence between the units, and that phi max is a sort of epiphenomenon that arises naturally as a consequence of the actual causal functions defined by recurrency. What would be your response to that?
Well, that is perfectly fine, actually, because it's not magic, right? So there's functional reasons for why you have integrated systems, which is precisely that they might be more economical. And then we just measure integrated information. So there is no principle of nature that should like.
Okay, yeah, but then one can argue that the concept is superfluous. It has no extra explanatory power relative to the recurrent nature of the network.
Well, it does, because it makes the specific shape, and eventually we want to explain consciousness with that shape, which you couldn't with just the recurrent processes, right? So you need the compositional structure in order to capture the compositional structures of the experience.
Aye.
Wolf Singer, and then we have a question up here.
Well, it's partially answered. It was referring to recurrency and there's an event in evolution. This is the invention of neocortex and hippocampus. And this is where recurrency is really exploited in order to generate or to produce a model that is, or a network that is able of generative integration properties. Is it this aspect of integration that you were mentioning? Because on your graph with the two axes, intelligence versus consciousness, it seemed that the AlphaGo, it's a simple feed-forward network. They had to implement a little bit of recurrency once it was a self-learning system in the latest version of it. But otherwise, it's deep convolution networks, all feed-forward, is linear, has no generative capacity. While the recurrent networks can do this. And to the best of my knowledge, this is evolutionary, a recent phenomenon. You see some recurrency in pattern generators in animals that have to move. You see it in insects and invertebrates. But within the cognitive systems, it seems to be reserved to vertebrates, starting with amniotes. So, would that make sense?
I'm not sure I understand. Sure. Yes. Oh, closer. Yes.
Well, the question was, is recurrency the trick?
Recurrency is a necessary
or
property.
re-entry?
Yes. So recurrency is a necessary property for having integrated information. Feed-forward systems are by default have zero integrated information. It's not sufficient. It's not a sufficient quantity, and there's a lot of debate always about the final the axiom, the exclusion axiom, and to explain why this is necessary. So not every system that has integrated information is integrated will be a physical substrate of consciousness. Only those that specify a maximum of integrated information. To understand that is that there have to be borders, and for every computational theory of consciousness, that is a problem, because you can take the brain, and not even all part of cortex will be part of the physical substrate of consciousness, most likely, right? But so there will be, so if I have this physical substrate and I add a neuron, it still has integrated information. If I subtract a neuron, it still has integrated information. But there's one specific configuration that will be the maximum of integrated information, and that is the physical substrate of consciousness in a system that is overall integrated. So, for example, there's a loop through the thalamus and back to the cortex, and it's not necessary for IT then that the thalamus needs to be part of the physical substrate just because it has a recurrent connection to the cortex, right? So there's an additional postulate.
We have a question up here.
Hi. So you explained why IIT may be a great, useful framework for understanding intelligent adaptive behavior in organisms. Now I wonder how it's related to consciousness, or in the sense of the big C. So one way to look at it is maybe, let's say that you solved all the problems, you proved this is true, you have all the details for IIT. Does it have any insight on the hard problem?
So it definitely has. So what I would say is it has the potential to address the hard problem. What I mean with that is that IIT makes predictions about the neural, about the physical substrate that can be categorized in three aspects. One, it says that it must be a maximum of intrinsic cause-effect power. Two, it says that the level of consciousness changes with the level of integrated information of the system. And three is the fact that the cause-effect structure is structurally identical to the experience. So what that means is that it's not about the information processing in the system. It's about, for example, there's some initial work that is done in the lab to map this intrinsic understanding of space. So what is space in the phenomenology to the cause-effect structure of grid-like systems that are organized sort of like your visual cortex. And the research plan is really to identify all the aspects in the experience that are related to space, so the relations between smaller and bigger blobs on a screen, for example, and map that to the cause-effect structure of that physical substrate. And ideally, we want to explain the whole experience, and then, as David said, also then the part that thinks about consciousness, but that comes probably last.
I know there are many more questions, but I'm afraid we'll have to wait until the general discussion because the time has run out again. So thank you again very much for your fascinating presentation. shall introduce the last speaker of this first session of the conference. I'm sure everyone in this room has either read or at least heard of Jean-Pierre Changeux. He's professor at Institut Pasteur and Collège de France, and he's one of the world's most famous scientists. He has received an astounding number of prestigious scientific awards, and I'm not going to list them all, but only mention the last one, which was a few weeks ago, namely the Albert Einstein World Award of Science. Among the notable achievements that Jean-Pierre has done during his long career, I will mention only two of the most relevant ones for this context. One is the theory of neuronal epigenesis by the selective stabilization of synapses, which I would like to point out has an extraordinary relevance for philosophy, social science, and ethics, and I would add educational structures. And that is also something that is a work of collaboration. But of course, the most relevant is that Jean-Pierre Changeux originally developed the global neuronal workspace theory of consciousness that he then proceeded to continue to develop together with his, at that time, doctoral student, Stanislas Dehaene. And this is one of the most influential models of consciousness today, and like the IIT, it has important clinical implications. For example, for understanding the mechanisms of coma, of anesthetics, and of drug addiction. If I may end on a slightly personal note, I've had the great pleasure of collaborating with Jean-Pierre for several years. We have together developed and co-directed the research area in HBP called Ethics and Society, and that has been for me an enormous privilege. So I'm pleased to present his talk, The Global Neuronal Workspace, Past, Present, and Future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katinka, for this very kind introduction. I don't know if I deserve it, because I am not going to give you a full theory about consciousness. That's for sure. I would just like to share with you some of the reflections we had, and in particular about the relationship between conscious processing and the brain. And this started 20 years ago. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary together with Stanislas Dehaene. And these ideas, I will try to present them in the framework of a system biology approach to conscious processing, from genes to cognition. And I wish to say that I have no conflict of interest in this. Oh, it's not working. Doesn't work. Please put back the time.
Yeah, I will count an end. Yes.
But it's not working anymore. So what's up? Oh, okay. Is it okay?
It does work.
Okay, so is it working now? Okay. Thank you. So this is just an overview of what I call a system biology approach of the human brain, in the sense that we have to deal with all levels of organization, from the atoms, the molecules, neurons, networks of neurons, and so on and so forth, and have a strong interrelationship between these levels of organization, and have altogether hierarchy and parallelism, diversification and integration, and bottom-up and top-down regulation. And first of all, the whole system is rooted in the physical and chemical environment, and we have to realize that if we wish to talk about conscious processing, we have to be aware that there are other elements which we must have in mind. Not only the social life, this was very briefly mentioned by Chalmers, language that nobody mentioned, cultural environment, as Katinka emphasized, and rational thinking. So this kind of overview means that all these functions I am just mentioning are interrelated with each other. And if we want to find some scientific approach to this system, I think we have to dissect this system and try to reconstitute. So it will not be necessarily a reductionist approach, but I would prefer to say that we are to reconstruct consciousness, if I may use the word, to further understand its function, its neural basis, and its evolution. So this view leads us to a view of the brain as the synthesis of multiple ongoing Darwinian evolutions, as a system which is self-organizing, a physico-chemical system. This is the brain as a chemical system, I don't hesitate to say that, and operating, as it was emphasized already by Katinka, in a projective style. Now, of course, we heard about definition of consciousness, of conscious processing. I am not a philosopher. In any case, these views about the definition of consciousness are the product of the conscious brain of the philosophers. That's for sure. Now, what I want to say is that we have to illustrate how difficult it is to try to find a definition of well-defined words. And that's the reason why I consider from the start that there are several hierarchical levels from non-conscious to conscious processing. And these hierarchical levels, to my opinion, are nested in each other. They develop during evolution and during brain development. And we have to account for their interrelationship at all stages of experimentation we are dealing with. First of all, there is the access to multiple states of vigilance, wakefulness, dream, sleep. That's for sure. I think nobody is going to contest that. Then there is, I would put in second, the capacity for the subjective experience of global integration, including not only the color, but the context of the color, and the resulting cognitive processing that was discussed by Ned Block. I would include them within the definition of consciousness. Then a minimal form of intentionality, which include the spontaneous drive to survive. Katinka mentioned the conatus from Spinoza, which is something, to my opinion, which is an intrinsic part of conscious processing, even in the lower organism. And then an issue which is not dealt with by most neurophysiologists today, and very few philosophers, if I may say, the capacity to interact socially with other agents, with self and other distinction. And this is something which is very important, because any experiments that we are doing involve at least two partners, the scientist and the subject, and they are interacting. So to separate what is strictly individual and due to the relationship between subjects is something, to my opinion, extremely difficult, and at this stage, at least in human beings, we have to deal with both together. So this view is, in fact, raising a very important question. What are the architectures involved in these different features I just illustrated before? What are what I call the architectures of conscious processing? This is a view which is, according to Jerry Edelman, initially opposite to the theory which was just presented before, in the sense that we want to be extremely specific about the different levels of consciousness I just discussed before. And first of all, the one which is basic, which is the states of wakefulness and sleep. And I may say that there is a long tradition, there is a very important literature that is today somewhat ignored, I'm sorry to say that, which is absolutely essential to the understanding of these states of wakefulness and sleep from Penfield, and John showed a picture of Penfield, and Jasper and Hobson and Jones and many others. And the main conclusion is that there is a separate system in the brain, in the vertebrate brain at least, which is involved in the regulation of the states of wakefulness and sleep, which is the pontine ascending reticular ascending system. So that's absolutely well established. Second thing, which is from the work of Llinas, I am pleased to see him here with us, that when we build circuits which are thalamo-cortical, which are involved in this process, and as you see here, you can already clearly distinguish physiologically, and this might be helpful for the philosopher to have the definition associated with actually physiological recording between wake, sleep, and anesthesia or whatever. So this put the emphasis on the thalamo-cortical relationship, and I am not going to abandon that by all means. And on the other opposite, try to connect all this knowledge to what I am going to say about conscious processing. And there is, if you wish, a distinction between state and content of consciousness. It's a little bit simple-minded to make this kind of distinction, but at least there is some kind of conscious processing which is taking place in the awake subject. And I may say that I'd have a strong bias to say that these phenomena, the res cogitans of Descartes, have some features which are distinct from the processes which are taking place during non-conscious processing, the res extensa of Descartes. And this was already an idea proposed by Jasper, that there are characteristic brain mechanisms involved in conscious processing, and that there is even a pharmacology. Selezia and Jasper already in 1966 proposed that acetylcholine was in fact a neurotransmitter specifically involved in conscious processing. Not the only one, but have a dramatic role on it. I may say a few words during my presentation. Now, we were concerned, Larissa and myself, by the idea to complement what is on the left of the picture by another view which was more integrative, which was proposed. I gave a course at the Collège de France on Barr's book, which I think for all the students who are here have to be read by them, which is a very interesting book where Barr distinguishes between processors, which are non-conscious, automatic, and so on, and a global workspace, which is involved in the integration of and the broadcasting of these signals coming by the non-conscious processors. So this is, in fact, a psychological model which we found adequate for us to further document from a neurobiological point of view. And the issue was what kind of structure in the brain can contribute to this global neuronal workspace, and that's the difference between Barr's and ourselves, what can be the kind of structure in the brain which interconnect these different processes, let's say the visual, the auditory, and motor, and reward system in the brain all together in something where, in this physical space, there would be some kind of unity for conscious processing. You can see it at the level of the thalamus. Maybe there are some connections, but we prefer to see it at the level of the cerebral cortex itself, which is, of course, connected with the thalamus. And on the basis of these observations by Ramon y Caral, that in the layer 2-3 of the cerebral cortex, the pyramidal cells have privileged long-range axons, which may, in fact, interconnect at long distance, centimeters, tens of centimeters, territories of the brain and globally integrate them. So this is consistent with the view of von Economo, who also showed that there are, in fact, different layer structure in the prefrontal parieto-temporal cingulate cortex, where the the pyramidal neurons with long-range axons are dominant compared to the other territories. You can find that in the human brain there are indeed white matter fascicles, which were already distinguished by Desjardins and confirmed completely by recent brain imaging techniques. And one should not forget that Patricia Goldman-Rakic already established some kind of long-range connectivity network in the monkey, which precisely include what I mentioned, the prefrontal cortex, okay, but not exclusively the prefrontal cortex, but as well the parieto-temporal cingulate cortex, among other territories of the brain. And very interestingly, if you look at the work done recently by Kennedy and Van Essen and colleagues, you find that if you look at the network where the 24% stronger links are found, you almost have there the global neuronal workspace. So this is, if I may say, physical reality, and the hypothesis that we propose is that these long-range axons, which link prefrontal parieto-temporal cingulate cortex and their thalamic relationship, I wish to insist on that, in fact are able to broadcast signals to multiple brain areas and conversely. So that there is, in fact, a reciprocity and reafference included in the definition of the model. Interestingly, just one word about the evolution. I can discuss that extensively later on if you wish. If you look at the evolution of language, which, after all, is one of the very strong characteristics of the human brain, I would say it's even, according to Chomsky, the characteristic of the human brain compared to the apes and monkeys and so on, then you find that there is a strong increase here of the long-range connectivity involved in the language area. And I would even say something more, the capacity of the global workspace, if I may say, and in fact of the working memory I already mentioned, which goes from 1 to items in monkeys to the magical number of 7 ± 2 of Miller, and which in fact give to the human subject the ability to build linguistic propositions, and I think this is extremely important, which is, according to Chomsky, the merge process. I would say that this kind of view is, of course, highly consistent with what I just presented about the global neuronal workspace. Everybody knows that. And just to simply illustrate the notion of encapsulated modular automatic processors, which is, of course, a very strong simplification. I want to insist on that. And the global workspace, which broadcasts signal, I just mentioned that, and which yield the subjective experience of being conscious, global availability, selection of representation through reward and reportability, in the sense that this has to do with a state of consciousness in the adult human being. Of course, this definition may have exception in the case of the WASP, as was nicely presented. I will come back on that at the very end of my presentation. So the main issue I want to insist is, I said that I will give only a very sketchy presentation. The importance of the brain's spontaneous activity, which is very interesting because there is, in fact, in this default network, one which corresponds strictly to the global neural workspace. And the idea is that there is a variability of this spontaneous activity. And this, of course, is something which makes possible some kind of genesis of pre-representation, some variability, which is in fact intrinsic to the human brain, and selection of some of these representations in the conscious workspace. So the first task we try to model in the original paper, the Changeux in 1998, is the Stroop task that you all know. When you are here, you have to say what is the color of the ink in this word, but you say blue, of course. That's true. But when you ask here and read yellow, then the tendency is said, oh, yellow. In fact, it's red. So it's a mistake that is being self-corrected. And the model we built from this Stroop task in the original paper is that, of course, we include this variability I just mentioned from one representation to another. Then the reward, which selects the network through allosteric transition, possibly including dopaminergic receptor. And this selection is taking place through the reward, which is included in the global neuronal workspace in its original formulation. So this is perhaps a cognitive task or a consciously cognitive solution of a given task. I have no objection about that. I just want to say that this is clearly a kind of model that we can propose for it on the basis of the global neuronal workspace. And what I want to also say, incidentally, that this combinatorial power increases with the global neuronal workspace capacity until what Chomsky called discrete infinity, which is a representational landscape that we have and that BAT does not have. So this is an implementation of perhaps of the merge process. Now, just to illustrate the simulation of the early work on the global neuronal workspace, passing the Stroop task, and you see that there is a trial and error task, which in fact takes place in the global neuronal workspace, and then once the task is being learned through positive reward, there is an execution and then the routinization. And you can see how it looks at the level of brain imaging. And indeed, the data which were available and still available on that are consistent with this model. It doesn't mean that it fully demonstrates the model. It shows that there is a consistency with it. Now, additional tasks have been used, particularly by Stanislas and his colleagues, like, for instance, the masking task, where you have two stimuli, T1, T2, and you change the distance between the two stimuli, which are visual stimuli. And when you ask for target 2, there is a retrograde masking, and therefore the stimulus become non-consciously processed. So we can compare here the consciously versus non-consciously processed. This is an old slide, but just very interesting to illustrate that one can show a difference, which was referred to P300. It's not the final answer. This is just an indication of what's happening, which is, in fact, distinct from the signal you record from non-conscious processing. This is a more recent synthetic slide, which have been proposed by Malak, and you will see that there is not only this ignition process which is taking place, but also that there is a self-sustained activity, which is perhaps one of the most characteristic aspects of conscious processing, in the sense that it's stable on time, and that we, of course, remember in our conscious workspace some elements which have been elicited by stimulation with the external world, and very interestingly, I'm sure Professor Rodolfo is going to discuss that in this meeting, that you may have, in fact, very reproducible response which resemble very much this kind of signal, which, as you can see here, and also the scheme that he presents, or they present in their paper, is exactly the one we proposed together with Stanislas a few years ago. So there seems to be at least an approach to what the rest cogitans of Descartes is. In fact, it's some kind of activity in the cerebral cortex, which in fact differ from between conscious and unconscious area. Now, these kind of signals found during ignition have been found in the human brain by many groups for years as a spontaneous activity and referred to as ultra-slow resting fluctuations in humans. This was reported by Moutard and a colleague, Dehan and his colleagues recently in Neuron. And the interesting thing is that Fanny Koukouli from my lab, from a very brilliant Greek postdoc, was able to use awake mice, prefrontal cortex, calcium imaging, and very interestingly, there are in the mouse some of these ultra-slow fluctuations. They are reduced by general anesthesia, and very interestingly, and in agreement with the view of Koch himself, and the nicotinic receptor knockout mouse here show a dramatic perturbation of this ultra-slow fluctuation, and a pharmacological antagonist of the beta-2 nicotinic receptor also perturb these ultra-slow fluctuations. So there is clearly a contribution of acetylcholine and nicotinic receptor in this kind of, at least, conscious processing. And of course, it's a new strategy to design nicotinic drugs against schizophrenia and Alzheimer's disease. Also, another aspect which is very important for us is general anesthesia itself. It is the chemistry of consciousness, and I think for us, biochemists and molecular biologists, this is a very interesting way to look at conscious processing. You remember the scheme I showed before, and the idea is that there is not only a feed-forward and feedback connection. This is the model we proposed with Sergent quite a while ago in 2003. And the postulate I made at the time was that the general anesthetics are acting, in fact, at the level of the connectivity of the cortex, the pyramidal cells which feed back to other cortical areas. And you can see that this has been, in fact, demonstrated by the group of Machour and Udest, and you can see here that selectively, according to them, there is an alteration of the frontoparietal connectivity versus the parietal frontal connectivity. And the recent progress of the molecular biology and X-ray crystallography of some of these ligand-gated ion channels similar to the nicotinic receptor show that indeed the sites for general anesthetics are located in the transmembrane domain, and there is an allosteric modulation by the general anesthetics of this kind of reafference responsible for consciousness. I don't want to say this is the answer of consciousness, but at least this is some phenomenon which we may have to deal with. Now, very quickly, just want to say that they have been in development on cognitive reasoning and the global neuronal workspace. Just to say that complex reasonings form meta-system of networks which are consistent with the thing. That there are also evidence for a paralimbic system of self-reference. This is experiments that were inspired by Hans Lu from Denmark, where he has been looking at meditation and the networks involved by magnetoencephalography. And the proposal is that, in fact, there is one characteristic features of conscious processing if the ability to control one's own behavior. And this is, of course, something which is very simply, and everybody agrees on that, being disconnected in the case of addiction, where the subject is unable to repress its desire to take the drug. So there is clearly, if you wish, an alteration of conscious behavior, if I may say, in the sense that there is this kind of disconnection which is possibly under the control, and this is a recent paper published in Neuron on drug addiction, where you see that the territories from the prefrontal cortex are becoming decreased, while those from the limbic system are going to be increased in the case of addiction. So I will just say that there is some kind of synchronization between brains which is taking place during social interaction. This is just to say that one can approach now objectively social consciousness. And this was in particular done by Guillaume Dumas from the Pasteur Institute. And I reassure you, this is the last slide. I am not going to take too much of my time. And this is the last time. It's perhaps, again, an ongoing work from the last few slides I showed. And this is being done by Drew Grover, who is a postdoc working in Ralph Greenspan laboratory at UCSD. And I may say that I've been very pleased to be in his lab for the past 4 years. And but only a few months per year, unfortunately. And the achievement they have made, which is not yet published, so keep that for yourself, is that if one tries delay versus trace conditioning with the fly, you find that there is indeed some trace conditioning in the fly. Now, whether it's an objective proof for the occurrence of conscious processing in the fly, I leave that for the discussion. But the fact is that one can follow the territories in the fly brain which are being involved, and our main aim, which was the beginning of this thing, is to see whether there are some common features in the connectivity which is engaged in trace versus delay conditioning in the fly compared to what we have, and in the human brain, and in particular the global neuronal workspace. So this is my conclusion. I'm just on time, consciously. No, let me finish. I just say what the conclusion is that, and in fact it has to do with what we have to understand in the future. One is the gene parsimony, and when I saw the previous slide with mutation giving animate, something like that, one has to remember that in the case of the human evolution, the number of these events is very small, at least from what is known. So there is, in fact, only a few genetic regulatory events. They are being, of course, investigated by Svante Pääbo and many other ones, but we have to solve that. Now, there are, in between the genes and the network, of course, some steps which have not been even mentioned here. which are the gene assemblies and so on, which are involved in the long-range connectivity, which is the one we privilege. And last but not least, there is some kind of global integration. And this is my last word. And the global integration has to take place in the brain through areas which are, most of them, developing independently, like the two eyes. And what happens when you have the space, for instance, binocular vision? Well, you need to have the two eyes matched together, as we need to have the different territories of our brain matched together, and there, epigenesis is needed. So, thank you very much. This is not my brain, but that of Nikit Saint-Phal. Do you like my brain? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, for a wonderful presentation. Before opening for the questions for Jean-Pierre, let me just say that we will postpone the lunch for half an hour. I hope everyone agrees with this and doesn't get a blood sugar low, because we want to have some time also for the general discussion. So lunch is half an hour postponed. So, open, yes?
Thank you. It is a very interesting talk. Consciousness is created by the synchronous neural vibration of a very large number of neurons in the brain everywhere. And that vibration creates brain wave. Vibration means oscillation. Oscillation up
Yes,
there.
yes,
Now, that creates brain wave.
yes.
And that brain wave frequency could be from 0.5 cycles per second to 100 plus. The more conscious we are, the higher is the brain wave frequency. You agree with that? So I would say the consciousness is a function of the brain wave frequency.
Yes, I have no objection about that. And I think Wolf Singer is going to discuss that more extensively. And clearly
So,
for instance, the interesting thing is Fried, for instance, has shown that the frequency of oscillation from the feed forward to the feedback one, to the reference, are different. And this is a very interesting observation along your lines.
So instead of saying it's a G and W workspace, I would suggest you call it brain, BNW brain, or NNW neural network workspace.
Whatever you like.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. I think this issue of oscillation is a very important one, and it's certainly something to further investigate. And Rodolfo Llinas already, who I put asleep now, but he has already in his time illustrated that very explicitly. Yeah, there is a question here.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, very interesting talk. I have a question about attentional blink data, where you see first ignition and then sustained activity.
Yes.
I was just wondering, do you think, because it's also possible, in attentional blink, you also have to report later on what you saw.
Yes.
So perhaps this sustained activity doesn't reflect consciousness so much as it reflects working memory. Do you think that could be a possibility?
Then I think we are going to have a debate on what you call consciousness. As you saw from the beginning, I started from awareness until social interaction. All that under the word consciousness. And what I don't make the opposition that network made between perception, I would say, and cognitive processing. On the opposite, I think very early on they are linked and integrated together. So that's for me an answer to your question, if you accept.
Yeah, okay, I accept. But I was wondering, do you think then, for instance, these no-report paradigms, where you try to delineate between reporting,
no, but
work memory,
the issue now is an experimental one, which is very nice, because there is indeed a prediction there, is that, first of all, this record is, from the start, a complex record. It's not a single kind of process. It includes, to my opinion, it includes several processes that we have to further dissect. And there are no opposition with the fact that once you have this, perceptive event, then there is a self-propagation, autonomous continuation, just to link with precisely the cognitive processing. So my view is that, in fact, this, and according, which is in agreement with what you say, that you may have a first reaction, which is just a perceptive event, and then a maintenance in the working memory of the signal to give, in fact, the conscious perception from the beginning. I'm sorry to say that. We can discuss that with Ned.
Thank you. I think we must now pass to the... Oh, Johan, do you want to...
No, just before we start the general discussion, I would like to apologize for two things in my presentation. It was very... of the history of this field, because it, as I said, it was very incomplete and crude, etc. And in particular, I would like to apologize that I didn't mention that the neural correlates of consciousness that they ascribed to Koch and Crick, etc., where I learned from, was actually preceded by David Chalmers' work, where he proposed this kind of concepts before. And also, I would like to apologize to Katinka that they didn't mention more that part of the human brain project, that she belongs to the philosophical part.
There is also the Brentano, who has, and many others who have been involved in phenomenological consciousness. There is a whole tradition on that you did not mention.
I said it was very, very incomplete, but just to give you a glimpse. Anyway, let's now move to the general discussion, and we'll...
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, once more for a wonderful... And we will now move to the general discussions, but I also have to mention an omission I made. As you may know, philosophers, at least I and many of my colleagues, are notoriously bad in making cool PowerPoint presentations. And I think I had only one cool picture in my PowerPoint presentation, the one with the double Descartes. And it wasn't me, and I forgot to mention it in the context, it was Greg Mylan, our webmaster at the HBP, who does fantastic work in presenting things in a more attractive way. So I just want to thank him warmly for helping us out with these things. So now we have a general discussion with questions to all the speakers of the first session. You want? Yeah, maybe we should. Yeah, we should have. Okay, let's have all speakers on the stage.
What? Okay. Yeah, we'll now have the general discussion. We have only half an hour, fortunately, but we have all the speakers there. So I think we'll just open for those questions that didn't make it through for the various speakers, and then move to more general topics. Are any other questions ready to be made now? I have I don't see anybody. I have one myself in the meantime. To Ned, very interesting this example of these cards that I showed briefly, where we interpreted red spades as being hearts, right? And you asked whether that was during the perception or whether this was some afterthought where he conceptualized this. I think this may be perhaps solved by this new realization of this dendritic processing that Macularcum has discovered, where the feedback and context information comes in, and then the cell, so to speak, the circuit sort of jumps to a conclusion that's part of the perception. So unless it can come to a conclusion what this really is, there is no real percept according to this. So that, I think that may help to solve this. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know the work that you're talking about. I mean, there's certainly a lot of work on top-down effects,
yeah.
Cognitive effects on perception. The most significant examples are cases of ambiguous figures, where knowing what the thing is supposed to be can strongly influence your perception. And certainly a second area is attention, where we know that a lot of really good work has shown that attention can affect the visual system at various levels. So there certainly is a lot of work showing that the cognitive system can affect perception, but you know, my take on the issue is that the effects are pretty constrained, and so I think there are probably a lot of cases where, you know, people say, "Oh, it looks expensive," or Jean-Pierre said, "It looks like a Poussin," where that isn't really a perceptual state. That is a perceptual judgment, a cognitive state. So I don't believe that there are high-level perceptual representations of expensiveness or Poussin. But look, obviously it's an empirical question, so...
yeah, I think it is. Yeah. Jean-Pierre?
Well, just to react to this, first of all, the issue of the debate is whether you want to restrict the word consciousness to conscious perception. That's for sure. You are restricting from your definition already what conscious perception is. And in fact, conscious perception includes a semantic aspect in most of the case. We cannot see the word without attributing meaning to what we see. So I think, I don't think you are against this idea that the high-level cognitive processes are involved in conscious perception. You mentioned the case of Poussin I discussed with you at the coffee break. And what I want to say as an amateur of painting is that going to an auction sale and seeing all the paintings, then suddenly, through looking at that, you have, if I would say, a switch in your conscious space when you see one. And most of the time, you don't know exactly what it is. But you know that it's a good painting and that you have to further look at it and try to find a name to attribute to it. So I would rather say that you have intermediate between perceiving simply the color of the baby and I would say perceiving a work of art in a mature person who had submitted a lot of epigenesis in the development of its cerebral cortex and in particular of the global neuronal workspace.
Look, I think you cannot just rely on introspection. It is not just a matter of introspection. It looks like a Poussin or it looks expensive. You have to use actual techniques that have been developed to tell the difference. One of them is, for example, do you get adaptation for the purported high-level property that isn't just a matter of adaptation to colors, shapes, textures, motion, etc. So there are techniques for trying to ascertain whether the cases you're talking about really are high-level perceptual representations.
Yeah, and if I may just finish one thing, there is an example of Klingenbach, who has been working with children with distortion of the face. And then he has been recording EEGs. And when the child just look at another child with a distorted face, then the signal is different.
Well, I certainly agree that there are very many face representations that are purely perceptual. There's face adaptation, for example. There you can. Eleanor McCone has shown adaptation to individual facial physiognomies, and there's also adaptation to facial emotional expressions. So there's plenty of evidence for face representations in the visual system as opposed to the cognitive system.
I think there are some questions from the audience now. I'm not sure who was first now. Okay.
Hello, hi.
Please go ahead.
I have a question for Katinga. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a question about the model that you suggested, that you see consciousness on a continuum, right? And the question I have is it a prerequisite that an organism needs to experience the whole spectrum to go from being conscious to non-conscious in order to be an organism capable of for consciousness, or this is not a prerequisite and it just, we can imagine that we can be born, for example, with anencephaly and we stay at some part of the spectrum only?
Thank you very much for that question, which I think is really excellent. I would say it is not a prerequisite. And that is also what would allow the model to agree with those who say that lower level animals has consciousness. Those two questions are related. What we relate consciousness to is the presence of an appropriate level of intrinsic activity and resting state activity in the human brain. But the question where you need to draw the line is still something to be determined. And your question, whether full awareness is a prerequisite for having the continuum, I would answer negative to that. But it's a very good question.
Okay, next question.
I want to come back to Ned's distinction between the perception and the cognition again. I in general like your framework, and you probably know some of my work, but I think there is a really clear case of probably the perception that requires at least attention. You know, I don't know whether attention is a part of your cognition thing or perception part, but like unfamiliar and untrained types of the stimulation, let's say, you know, this human brain mapping logo, where half of them is red and half of them is blue, and that is located left and right. This kind of thing requires attention to bind it together. But you know, when you attend to that, you can clearly see it there. But if you don't attend to that, you have a fuzzy feeling of there is something over there, but you don't even know the orientation and things like that. So that kind of a percept, which is unfamiliar, untrained, and artificial, that seems to be a really clear case of the perception that requires cognition or at least attention.
Yes, I know this work. This is the Christoph's dual task work, and the red and green half of the disk requires more than minimal attention. I agree with that. So on my way of typing things, attention is not in itself a cognitive state. There are two kinds of attention. There's endogenous and exogenous. Exogenous is entirely non-cognitive. Endogenous is normally cognitively directed, but there's nothing in the intrinsic properties of attention that require cognition. No, I think the red-green thing requires attention, but it doesn't require cognition. Yeah, I guess that is endogenous attention in that experiment. Well, okay, so maybe it requires cognition, I don't know, but that's cognitively directed attention that affects perception. It does nothing to cause problems for the distinction between perception and cognition.
Okay, thank you. Georg, I think you were first, actually.
Yes, thank you very much for wonderful presentations. So I'm taking a step back in this question, and it goes out to the whole panel. When we talk about consciousness, and also as this section of the conference is on the fundamental aspects, this is why I bring this up now. When talking about consciousness, we always seems to end up in a discussion of neural correlates of consciousness, and those are cashed out in different biochemical or electrophysical concepts and so on. And seeing those are essentially physical descriptions of reality, I wonder if there is any worry in the panel regarding the possibility of using those concepts as fundamentals when trying to approach the subject of consciousness. And my worry is that since physics isn't really that well grounded in sort of trying to pinpoint the very basic fundamentals of reality, then how can we use those basics when reaching over, if you like, into the area of consciousness? Do you see my worry?
Anyone want to comment on that?
This was raised by the Abbé Méliès in his testament that you may know in the 17th century. And people were saying, how can you imagine that the human brain function can arise from a pile of sand? You know, there was the idea that if you use too materialistic description, then you will be under the pile of sand and not at the human brain function. And this is a criticism that personally I don't accept, because being myself a strong materialist, I believe that what is coming from our brain is also some kind of material representation of reality. And the issue is, how can you match the external reality with the physical reality of the brain, which is a question you raise. And the answer was given by Democritus, that already, if you try to do that, you know that you are limited by the capacity of your brain to do this kind of performance. So I think the idea to have an essentialist description of consciousness, something which is essentialist in the philosophical point of view, to my opinion, is a waste of time.
Okay, then this Nordhoff next.
Sorry, Johan.
Oh, okay, you have something. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think the issue really comes up for the neural correlates of consciousness per se. We've got perfectly good operational methods to identify neurons and brain systems that one can use to formulate these questions as well as one does anywhere else in neuroscience. I think it really comes up for thinking about the underlying metaphysics once one gets drawn to the philosophical question of what's really going on here, and for example, is consciousness physical? Some people will go on to say we've got good reason to think consciousness is distinct from the physical, but precisely here is where your question arises. How well do we understand the physical? My colleague Daniel Stoljar has written a very nice book arguing that in fact we don't understand, there are many things about the physical we don't understand very well, come to understand the physical better, and there might be room for a consciousness. The direction that's been pursued the most in recent years is to argue that our conception of the physical is somehow structural or mathematical, and that maybe what's actually going on in the physical world has to be deeper than structural and mathematical. It might have some intrinsic nature. This is the kind of route that leads some people to say a panpsychist view, where there's consciousness at the fundamental level of the physical, or some people to what's called a neutral monist view. There may be something underlying both the physical and the phenomenal. Maybe Katinka's intrinsic activity view could be developed in this direction as well. But I think it really does then arise at the level of the underlying metaphysical framework rather than the formulation of the science.
If I may just briefly comment that I agree. I just want to also point out a difference between the traditional neurosciences and physics, is that physics, sometimes if you look at, for example, string theory, it's not going to be falsifiable or testable in the foreseeable future, and yet it's accepted as one of the most exciting theories. It's a different approach, and I think sometimes I agree with you that we need to be careful now that I think philosophers agree that it's wonderful that the neurosciences have begun working with the consciousness. It's fantastic. I think it's needed. The a priori approach was lopsided, but with a too strong focus on empirical testability here and now, if it doesn't fly, if thought isn't allowed to fly as it is allowed in physics, it will be grounded before it even began to fly. And I think that is a risk with the neuroscientific approach today and with the neural correlate discussion, which I favor, but sometimes has me worried.
Thank you. Now it's only a few.
About the relationship with the knowledge we have of matter, in particular the structure of the atom, of the particles, and so on. The fact is that even if these things are not fully understood, they are sufficiently understood so that the chemistry of proteins, of nucleic acid, is well enough known so that we can build on these. That's my point. So, of course, the knowledge is not perfect, but as I said, for me, it's a metaphysical issue. Our knowledge is always limited, and the aim of science is to progress in the acquisition of knowledge. Nothing more.
I agree with that. So,
I wanted to basically comment on Katinka and David. I think one of the main problems in current consciousness, okay, we have the purely empirical approach, which focuses on the brain, focuses on a neuronal mechanism, and obviously those concepts are used in a dimensional way because we need quantifiable concepts where we can measure different degrees. The philosopher, the metaphysician, and as I understand the heart problem, does not focus on the natural world in which we observe the brain, but on all logical possible worlds. And also, of course, you probably use the concept more in a categorical rather than dimensional way as a neuroscientist. And I think there's a real gap between that. It's not the explanatory gap, it's a methodological gap. Yeah? The neuroscientist focuses by default on the brain and often neglects the world. That's why I liked your talk very much, where you linked the IIT to the environmental context. And that, I think, is a first step towards an ontology of the brain and then an ontology of consciousness. But that's still not there where you, as I understand you, locate the heart problem. The heart problem is a metaphysical problem, and you, as far as I see your work, you subsume the ontology under the metaphysics, which I, who is more neuroscientifically inspired philosopher, would not do. So I think we need an ontology, and I think what Katinka said goes into that direction, an ontology of the brain. First, just of the brain, which goes very much into the biology, also strongly on the empirical side. And that might provide a bridge to the kind of metaphysical problems we're talking on the philosophical side. And then we still have to deal with the different kinds of concepts, which are really different. I mean, you use in neuroscience, you have to use concepts which describe dimensionality, continuity, because that's what you measure, degrees. A philosopher would never use such concepts. You have to do all or nothing, categorical concepts. So I think my view is that we really need an ontology of the brain, just beginning, even independent of consciousness. That's, I think, where the spontaneous activity can provide a major input, a link. Yeah? And then we might able to bridge the gap to the heart problem, and let alone thinking about the meta problem.
I guess I don't agree that there's this particular difference between neuroscientists and philosophers. I think both groups are primarily focused on, the real world in a certain sense. They're both focused on the brain. They're both focused on consciousness, primarily, the way the brain actually is, and on the way that consciousness actually is. Different neuroscientists and different philosophers will give different descriptions of the brain and of consciousness, use different tools in every case. And I certainly agree that we need an ontology in the brain, of the brain in the sense of the best tools and the most powerful descriptions of the brain. Even more, we need an ontology of consciousness in the sense of the best tools and the best description to describe states of consciousness. But I think really, if there's a big difference, if there's a central difference between the neuroscientists and the philosophers, it's about the kind of connections that people are focused on drawing. At the moment, the neuroscience is primarily a science of correlation, drawing correlations between what's in the brain and of consciousness, and moving towards unifying explanatory frameworks, but such as IIT and the global workspace theory. But if you ask many people, both neuroscientists and philosophers, they're inclined to think that still leaves this explanatory gap open. And then the philosophers are perhaps more inclined to think about the kind of ontological issues of what underlies that explanatory gap and what we need in the way of, say, fundamental principles or ontology there. But again, I think neuroscientists talk about this too. So I'm inclined to resist that there's a fundamental distinction between what the neuroscientists say and what the philosophers say. Rather, there's the question of understand the brain as well as you can, understand consciousness as well as you can, and understand the connection between them. And I think both neuroscientists and philosophers are well placed.
Very short. So I think you interpret me stronger than I am. Of course, I agree that both focus on the same subject matter. Yeah? But you focus in different methodological ways on the same subject matter. And my claim is I do not describe here a metaphysical ontological difference or gap. I describe a difference in the methodological approaches with regard to the inclusion of the world, with regard to the kind of word you presuppose, with kind of concepts. That's all I'm pointing out. And I think we need to be aware, if we want to make an intrinsic link between these different views with respect to the same subject matter, then we need to be aware of these methodological differences, and we need to develop new methodological approaches. That's what I mean, for instance, by neurophilosophy. So my neurophilosophy is not the same kind of neurophilosophy of Dennett or Churchland. Yeah? It's a much different, it's much more integrative, if you want to say so. Yeah, non-reductive. And that's all I wanted to point out. And I think that's what is needed, because I think we get a lot of idea also from the ontology of the brain for very concrete empirical questions, and vice versa. That's all I'm saying.
We are approaching lunch very fast, but I would like to ask Larissa and David. I think, David, you implied somehow that there was a problem with the integrated information theory, that it would be hard to use that to explain the feeling that there is a problem of consciousness or something like that. I don't think I agree with that, because there's nothing in IIT that would exclude that kind of that question to arise. But do you want to comment on that, Larissa and David? Or David first, perhaps, what you meant by that? I didn't.
Yeah, I just intended it as a challenge for IIT. At least it's not obvious to me how it is that information integration and hi-fi is going to play any particularly central role in generating our reports. And there are some specific worries, such as the fact that on IIT there'll be computationally isomorphic systems like simulations generate exactly the same reports, but according to IIT with no consciousness at all. So at least I think there's the beginnings of a worry that the mechanisms responsible for consciousness may seem somehow independent of the mechanisms responsible for report. And maybe there's something for IIT to say in response. I mean, as I said in my response to Nao, it's no part of this claim that the mechanisms responsible for consciousness have to be the whole explanation of report. Of course, there'll be something else going on in report, introspection, language, and so on. But it better be that the mechanisms responsible for consciousness are playing a key role. If there was two independent processes, then our reports would have nothing to do with consciousness, and that would be bizarre. But anyway, it's a challenge, which I'm sure Larissa can answer.
Well, so IIT is not about brain function necessarily, right? It's about how the physical substrate, that is the brain, gives rise to the experience, and it explicitly tries to capture something like pure perceptual experiences of maybe animals that aren't capable of any kind of thinking about consciousness themselves. So this kind of self-introspection is an additional type of content of consciousness that is probably specific to us humans, right? And in the sense that it is a content of consciousness that should have its analogs in the cause-effect structure. Now, if we first have to solve the hard problem to solve the meta problem of the heart problem, then it goes from being easy supposedly to being even harder than the heart problem, right? So I think that the question about how report works can be studied and is interesting, but it's mostly a functional question, like what processes in the brain, how do specific percepts, specific concepts get pinged, and how can you, what is the connection between phenomenology and access? And there, IIT says that the phenomenology is incredibly rich, much richer than even imaginable, because there's millions of concepts, and every part of the conscious complex directly contributes to the experience. Now, you cannot dump all this information at once, obviously. It totally overloads all the channels of like report. So the report needs to ping specific aspects and then communicate those, but that's more functional then.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to stop there. There's so much more to discuss, and we'll have more discussion sections later. And lunch is now starting.
I want to say something, if you accept. Just one word.
Oh, sorry.
What I find in the ITT theory is the following. You propose the relationship between complexity, differentiation, and integration. Now, this theory was initially proposed by Henri Atlan. You may know him. He has recently published a beautiful book on Spinoza and cognitive neuroscience. And I think he did it in a very general manner, which, as you do at the end of your presentation, in the sense that this kind of very general overview deals with living organisms in general. You actually accept this statement because you should, even in the case of the yeast, that you have circuits which are interpreted the same way. So just to be frank, I don't see what is characteristic of consciousness in the whole theory.
Well, I think we have to stop somewhere because it's almost endless. And we will survive after lunch and we can continue then. And I think everything else will start half an hour later. So Marcello has told me that he will be able to give his talk remotely. And that will be 2:30. And then we continue with everything half an hour delayed. Okay?